Rosalinda Butler woke up that March morning in her small apartment on Hawthorne Street, just as she had spent most of her days for the past 3 years. Sunlight streamed through the worn curtains, illuminating the stacks of books scattered across the floor next to her bed. At 22, she was still living like a college student, even though she had been working as a librarian at the Belmont Public Library for 2 years after graduating from a local community college. Rosie was planning to apply to Ohio State University this fall, recalls her mother, Debbie Butler, a nurse at Miami Valley Hospital who raised her daughter alone after her divorce when Rosalinda was 14. She was saving money, working extra shifts at the library. She had big plans to get a degree in English literature, maybe even become a writer. But on that morning, Rosalind wasn't thinking about her future plans. She was thinking about the phone call she had received the night before from Jason Miller, her best friend since childhood. Jason sounded upset, almost desperate, when he asked her to meet him at their place, the old playground in Belmont Park, where they had spent countless hours as children. Jason Miller, 23, worked as a mechanic at Rick's Auto Service on Main Street, in the same neighborhood where he and Rosalinda had grown up. A tall, thin young man with brown hair and serious brown eyes, he was a quiet child who found his only true friend in Rosalinda. Their friendship began in 3rd grade at Belmont Elementary School, when Rosalinda defended him from a group of children who teased him about his stutter. Jason was a special child, says Margaret Wilson, their former elementary school teacher who is now retired. Very smart, but withdrawn. He had trouble communicating with other children except for Rosie. She was the only one who could understand him. Sometimes it seemed like he was completely dependent on her socially. Jason and Rosalinda's friendship continued through middle school and after graduation. They were inseparable, spending almost every day together. Jason often stopped by Rosalinda's job at the library, brought her coffee, helped her rearrange books, and sometimes just sat in the reading room while she worked. The library staff got used to seeing him there almost every day. He was very attentive, recalls Linda Carter, the library's head librarian. He always asked if Rosie needed help, worried if she was tired or hungry, but sometimes it seemed like too much. It was as if he couldn't leave her alone for even an hour. The Belmont neighborhood in Dayton was a typical working-class area where families lived for generations. Everyone knew each other, and news traveled fast. Victorian-era homes mingled with more modern buildings, and the main street was lined with small shops, cafes, and service businesses that served the local community. It was a place where young people either left in search of better opportunities or stayed and continued the cycle of modest, predictable lives. Jason clearly belonged to the second category. After graduating from high school, he earned his auto mechanics certificate at a local technical college and got a job with Rick Davis, who had been running an auto repair shop for 30 years. Jason was a reliable worker, though he was reserved. He rarely socialized with the other mechanics, preferring to work alone, and almost never joined them when they went out for a beer after work. Jason was a good mechanic, says Rick Davis. He was never late, he did his job well, but he was a strange guy. He always talked about Rosie. Rosie did this, Rosie said that. It seemed like he had no life of his own except the one he had with her. In the spring of 2024, a new man entered Rosalinda's quiet life. Mike Thompson, a 24-year-old history teacher, had recently moved to Dayton from Columbus to teach at Belmont High School. He was an educated, ambitious young man who planned to earn a master's degree and perhaps become a school principal. Mike was a frequent visitor to the library, preparing materials for his classes, and that's where he met Rosalinda. They liked each other right away, recalls Linda Carter. Mike was very polite and intelligent. Rosie lit up when he came in. She laughed more than usual and seemed more confident. Rosalinda and Mike's first date was in February at a small Italian restaurant in downtown Dayton. Rosalinda told Jason about it the next day, and his reaction was strange. Instead of being happy for his friend, he started asking a lot of questions about Mike, his intentions, his past. He wanted to know all the details of their conversation, where they had been, what time she had come home. Rosie mentioned that Jason became kind of intrusive after she started dating Mike. says Debbie Butler. He would call her several times a day, show up at her house unannounced. She told me he said he was just worried about her, but it was starting to annoy her. Jason's behavior became increasingly intrusive. He began asking Rosalinda's co-workers at the library about her plans and monitoring her social media with obsessive attention to detail. When Rosalinda posted photos with Mike, Jason would immediately comment or send her private messages asking where the photos were taken and who else was there. He became very possessive, notes Belmont High School psychologist Dr. Susan Wright, who later consulted with investigators on the psychological aspects of the case. Classic signs of unhealthy attachment. A person with this type of disorder perceives the object of their attachment as an extension of themselves, rather than as a separate individual with a right to their own relationships. By early March, tensions had reached a breaking point. Rosalinda began avoiding some of Jason's calls and canceled several of their regular dates, preferring to spend time with Mike. Jason, who was used to being the center of Rosalinda's world, found himself in a situation he couldn't control or understand. On the evening of March 14th, Rosalinda came home after dinner with Mike and found Jason sitting on the steps of her house. He looked upset and said they needed to talk seriously. According to Rosalinda's neighbor, Mrs. Helen Jones, who saw them through the window, the conversation was tense. Jason was gesticulating and appeared to be crying. Rosalinda looked concerned but patient. "I heard Rosie say something like, 'You're my best friend, but you can't control my life,'" Mrs. Jones recounts. And Jason replied that he just wanted to protect her, that this new guy didn't know her as well as he did. It went on for about 20 minutes, and then he left. The next day at work, Rosalinda seemed preoccupied. She told Linda Carter about her conversation with Jason and admitted that she was beginning to realize how unhealthy their friendship had become. "She told me she loved Jason like a brother, but she felt like she was suffocating," Linda recalls. "He wanted to know every detail of her life and got upset when she spent time with anyone else." Rosie started to realize that this wasn't normal. That was when, on March 18th, Jason called Rosalinda with a proposal that changed everything. He said he understood that he had behaved badly and wanted to make things right. He suggested throwing a small party over the weekend and inviting Mike and a few mutual friends so everyone could get to know each other in a casual setting. Rosie was so happy, her mother says. She thought Jason had finally accepted her relationship with Mike. She was willing to give him another chance at friendship. But those who knew Jason better could see that his behavior in the days leading up to the supposed party was far from normal. Rick Davis recalls that Jason was distracted at work, making mistakes he had never made before. He often left during his lunch break and returned with red eyes, as if he had been crying. "Something was wrong," says Rick. "He looked like a man who had made a difficult decision. I even asked him if everything was okay, but he just nodded and continued working." The relationship between Rosalinda and Mike developed quickly during February and March 2024. What began as chance encounters in the library turned into regular dates and long phone calls. Mike Thompson turned out to be exactly the type of man Rosalinda had been dreaming of. Educated, ambitious, with plans for a future beyond Dayton. Mike opened up a whole new world for Rosalinda, recalls her library colleague Jessica Morgan. He told her about places he had been, books he had read, his plans to get a master's degree. Rosie started talking about applying not only to Ohio State University, but to other schools, maybe even out of state. For Mike, Rosalinda was a refreshing contrast to the women he met in Columbus. She was sincere, curious, and unpretentious, unlike the city women he sometimes found fake. He appreciated her passion for literature and her dreams of writing her own stories. Rosie was special, says Mike, who agreed to be interviewed for this investigation. She wasn't trying to impress or be someone she wasn't. She had this childlike joy in discovering new things, new ideas. I fell in love with her authenticity. But as Rosalinda and Mike's relationship deepened, Jason's behavior became increasingly disturbing. Library staff began to notice that he was showing up more often, sometimes several times a day. He would come in ostensibly to borrow books or say hello to Rosalinda, but he would often linger, watching her from other tables in the reading room. It was creepy, Jessica Morgan admits. He would sit there for hours pretending to read a magazine, but I could see he was watching Rosie's every move. When visitors approached her, especially men, he would tense up and listen to every word. The first serious incident occurred in late February. Mike arrived at the library around 5 p.m. to meet Rosalinda after work. Jason had been there for 2 hours, sitting in a corner with a book on auto repair that he clearly wasn't reading. When Mike approached the counter to talk to Rosalinda, Jason stood up and walked toward them. Jason came over and introduced himself to Mike, says Linda Carter, the library supervisor who witnessed the situation. But it wasn't a normal introduction. He asked very personal questions: where Mike was from, where he used to live, why he moved to Dayton. Mike tried to be polite, but you could tell he was uncomfortable. Rosalinda tried to lighten the mood by suggesting they all go for coffee, but Jason declined. Instead, he said he had to go, but not before reminding Rosalinda of their weekend plans, which, as it turned out, didn't exist. Mike was puzzled by the interaction. There was something strange about that guy, Mike says. He talked to me, but he kept looking at Rosie, as if he was waiting for some kind of reaction from her. And he knew so many details about her life: what she had for breakfast, who she talked to on the phone the night before. It was intense. After that incident, Rosalind spoke openly with Mike for the first time about her relationship with Jason. She explained their long friendship and how he had supported her through difficult times, especially during her parents' divorce. But she also admitted that she was starting to feel suffocated by his constant attention. Rosie told me that Jason called her every morning to find out what she was doing that day, Mike recalls. If she didn't answer, he kept calling. Once, he called 11 times in a row because she was in the shower and couldn't hear the phone. The situation escalated in early March when Rosalinda and Mike decided to spend the weekend in Columbus. Mike wanted to show her the university campus and introduce her to some friends. Rosalinda was excited about the mini vacation, but when she told Jason, his reaction was explosive. "I overheard their conversation through the window," says Mrs. Helen Jones, Rosalinda's neighbor. "Jason was yelling something like, 'You don't even know this guy, and how can you trust him?'" Rosie tried to calm him down, but he was beside himself. According to Rosalinda, who later told her mother about it, Jason accused her of changing, saying that her new boyfriend was driving her away from her real friends. He threatened that if she went to Columbus, he would no longer be her friend. Rosalinda was shocked by this ultimatum. She came home in tears, recalls Debbie Butler. She said she didn't understand how Jason could demand that she choose between him and Mike. "I told her that a real friend would never give her an ultimatum like that." Despite Jason's protests, Rosalinda went to Columbus. The weekend was wonderful. Mike showed her around the Ohio State University campus. They visited several museums and dined at restaurants she could never afford in Dayton. Rosalinda got a taste of the life she had dreamed of. But when they returned on Sunday evening, Rosalinda was in for an unpleasant surprise. Jason had been spending time with her mother, helping her with repairs around the house and accidentally mentioning his concerns about Mike. "Jason told me he had checked out Mike," Debbie Butler recounts. "He claimed that Mike had changed jobs frequently and that there had been problems at his previous school. I didn't know whether to believe it, but Jason seemed genuinely concerned." When Rosalinda found out about the conversation, she was outraged. She confronted Jason on the phone, accusing him of trying to turn her mother against her. It was their first real fight in all their years of friendship. "Rosie yelled at him," says Mrs. Jones, who once again found herself an unwitting witness. "She said something like, 'This is crossing the line, and you have no right to interfere in my family.' I could hear Jason crying on the other end of the line." After that incident, Rosalinda began to deliberately distance herself from Jason. She stopped answering his calls, canceled their weekly coffee dates, and asked him not to come to her work so often. For Jason, who was used to being the center of Rosalinda's world, it was a disaster. Rick Davis noticed a sudden change in Jason's behavior at work. He started making mistakes he never made before, says the auto shop owner. He forgot to tighten bolts, misdiagnosed problems. I had to redo his work several times. Jason's co-workers also noticed the changes. Tony Morelli, another mechanic at the shop, says, Jason was always quiet, but now he seemed absent. He would mumble to himself, and sometimes I would hear the name Rosie. Once I saw him crying behind the building during his break. The situation reached a new low in mid-March when Rosalinda and Mike announced on social media that they were officially dating. A photo of them hugging in front of a restaurant in downtown Dayton received numerous likes and comments from friends wishing them happiness. Jason responded with a series of obsessive messages. First, he left a long comment under the photo expressing his concern that everything was happening too fast. When Rosalinda deleted the comment, he started sending her private messages, begging her to talk to him. He was sending her like 20 messages a day, recalls Rosalinda's friend Emily Clark, who worked as a nurse at a local hospital. Rosie showed me some of them. They were strange. He wrote about how happy they were before Mike came along, about how he was the only one who really understood her. One of the messages Rosalinda saved and later gave to the police was particularly disturbing. You've forgotten who you were before him. I remember the real Rosie, and I won't let her disappear. We mean too much to each other to let anyone destroy that. Mike began to notice that Jason's presence was affecting their relationship. Rosalinda became nervous, constantly checking her phone, and sometimes seemed tense during their dates. She started looking over her shoulder when they walked down the street, as if she expected to see a familiar face. One night, we were having dinner at a restaurant and Rosie suddenly tensed up, Mike recalls. She saw a gray pickup truck in the parking lot and said it might be Jason's car. We even left early through the back door. That's when I realized the situation was serious. The escalation reached a critical point on March 13th when Jason showed up at Mike's house. The teacher lived in a small rented apartment near the school, and around 10 p.m., he heard a knock on the door. Through the peephole, he saw an unfamiliar man, but when he opened the door, he realized it was Jason. He looked terrible, Mike recalls. Unshaven, red eyes, his clothes were wrinkled. He said we needed to talk man-to-man about Rosie. I invited him in because I didn't want the neighbors to hear. The conversation lasted almost an hour and was extremely tense. Jason told Mike the truth about Rosalind, about her past relationships, her family problems, how she relied on him for emotional support. He claimed that Mike didn't know the real Rosalind and that their relationship was hurting her. He talked about her as if she were his property, Mike says. He kept saying, "My Rosie, and you don't understand her like I do." He even showed me pictures on his phone, hundreds of pictures of Rosie, including ones he had clearly taken secretly. The most disturbing part of the conversation was Jason's warning. He told Mike that if he really cared about Rosalind, he should leave her alone because she wasn't ready for a serious relationship, and that forcing her into one could lead to bad consequences. When he said that, there was something threatening in his voice, Mike recalls. Not a direct threat, but a hint that something bad might happen if I didn't listen. I told him that my relationship with Rosie was none of his business and asked him to leave. The next day, Mike told Rosalinda about Jason's visit. Her reaction was a mixture of anger, fear, and deep sadness. She realized that the friendship she had cherished for most of her life had turned into something dark and controlling. She told me she felt like she was losing her best friend and her stalker at the same time, Mike says. Rosie was torn between her love for a man who had been a part of her life for so long and the realization that his behavior had become unacceptable. It was in this emotional state that Rosalinda received that phone call from Jason on March 18th, a call inviting her to a party, which she interpreted as an attempt at reconciliation, unaware of what was brewing in her childhood friend's mind. Jason's phone call to Rosalinda on the evening of March 18, 2024, was a turning point in their relationship, although she did not realize it at the time. Jason's voice sounded different. calmer than it had in recent weeks, almost conciliatory. He apologized for his behavior and said he had spent a lot of time thinking about their friendship. "Rosie told me about the call that same evening," recalls her mother, Debbie Butler. "She was so relieved. She said Jason finally understood how his behavior had affected her. He suggested we have a small get-together so everyone could get to know each other in a relaxed setting." According to Rosalinda, Jason explained that he wanted to fix things and show that he could accept Mike as part of her life. He suggested throwing a party on Saturday, March 23rd, at his uncle's house in the country, where they often spent time as children. The location was secluded, perfect for quiet conversation without prying eyes. Jason said he would invite a few mutual friends. Emily, maybe Tony from the auto shop, a couple of other people, Rosalinda told her friend Jessica Morgan the next day. He wanted it to be informal, like old times, but with Mike as the guest of honor. Jason's uncle Frank Miller's house was about a 20-minute drive from Dayton, in the wooded area of Montgomery County. Frank was a truck driver and was often away for several weeks at a time. Jason sometimes looked after the house, had a set of keys, and knew his uncle's travel schedule. Frank always told Jason he could use the house when he was away, confirms Frank's neighbor, Bob Wilkins. Jason was a good nephew, helped out with odd jobs, made sure everything was in order. We saw him there quite often. After talking to Jason, Rosalinda called Mike to tell him about the offer. Mike was skeptical, given recent events, but agreed for Rosalinda's sake. He saw how important this friendship was to her, despite all the problems. "To be honest, I didn't trust Jason," Mike admits. "After he visited my house, I thought he was unpredictable. But Rosie wanted so badly to believe that he had changed, that he could be the friend she remembered. I didn't want to destroy her hopes." Over the next few days, Jason busily prepared for the party. He bought groceries at the local supermarket, including barbecue ingredients and Rosalinda's favorite snacks. Cashier Cindy Lewis remembers his purchases because he seemed unusually excited. "He bought a lot of stuff. Meat for the grill, potato chips, soda," Cindy said. "He mentioned something about an important party with friends. He seemed happy, but kind of strangely happy. Too intense for just a party." Jason was also acting differently at work at the auto repair shop. Rick Davis noticed that he had become more focused and was working faster than usual, as if he were in a hurry to get out for something important. "He worked like a man possessed all week," Rick recalls. "He came in early, left late, took on extra tasks. I thought he was trying to make up for his recent mistakes, but now I realize he had other plans." Tony Morelli, Jason's co-worker, recalls a strange conversation they had on Thursday before the party. Jason asked him if he wanted to come to the party on Saturday, but when Tony agreed, Jason suddenly said he had changed his mind and that the party was only for close friends. "It was strange," Tony says. "First he invites me, and then he seems to change his mind right in the middle of the conversation. He said something like, 'Actually, it should be more intimate.' I didn't understand what he meant." Meanwhile, Rosalinda was enthusiastically planning her outfit and thinking about what gift to bring. She wanted the evening to be perfect so that Jason and Mike could finally hit it off. On Friday, she even bought a bottle of nice wine as a conciliatory gesture. "She was so excited," recalls Linda Carter from the library. "All Friday morning she talked about how great it would be to spend time with Jason again without all the tension. She really believed that their friendship could return to the way it was." However, there were also worrying signs that, in retrospect, seem like ominous omens. Emily Clark, Rosalinda's friend who was supposed to have been invited to the party, never received an invitation from Jason. "Rosie mentioned that I would be there," Emily says, "but Jason didn't call me. I thought maybe the plans had changed or he had forgotten. Now I realize that maybe I was never meant to be invited." On Friday evening, Jason called Rosalinda again to confirm the plans, but this conversation was shorter and more formal than their previous communication. He gave her the exact address of his uncle's house and told her to come around 7 p.m. on Saturday. "Something about his voice seemed strange to me," Rosalinda later told her mother. "He sounded distant. like he was reading from a script, but I thought he was just nervous about meeting Mike. Mike also noticed a change in Jason's demeanor when he called him on Friday evening to personally invite him. The conversation was polite but cold, and Jason gave very clear directions on how to get to the house. He was very precise with the details, Mike recalls. He told me about every turn, every landmark. He said the place was pretty isolated, so GPS might not work properly. That should have tipped me off, but I just thought he wanted to make sure we didn't get lost. On Saturday morning, Jason arrived at his uncle's house early, around 10 a.m., to get everything ready for the evening. Neighbor Bob Wilkins saw his car in the driveway and noticed him unloading several large bags and some tools. "I thought he might be doing some repairs for Frank," Bob says. "He often helped out around the house. But it was strange to see him there so early if the party was planned for the evening." Jason remained inside the house all day, not going outside. Bob didn't see any other cars or people arriving to prepare for the party, which seemed unusual for a large gathering. Rosalinda spent Saturday in anticipation. She met Mike for lunch, and they discussed the evening. Rosalinda was full of hope, and Mike tried to share her enthusiasm despite his doubts. "We talked about what topics would be safe to discuss," Mike recalls. Rosie made a mental list of things that might interest Jason: sports, cars, shared memories. She really wanted us to hit it off. After lunch, Rosalinda went home to get ready. She chose a simple but pretty outfit, a blue dress she knew Jason liked, and comfortable shoes. She wanted to look nice but not too dressy for a country party. "She looked beautiful when she left," recalls Debbie Butler. She took that bottle of wine and a small gift for Jason, a book about classic cars she found at a used bookstore. She kissed me goodbye and said she wouldn't be back too late. Around 6:30, Mike arrived to pick up Rosalinda. They decided to drive together in his car, as the road was unfamiliar and they didn't want to get lost in separate cars. Neighbors saw them leave together, laughing and talking. The drive to Uncle Jason's house took about 25 minutes. The road was indeed winding and fairly isolated, especially the last few miles. Mike followed Jason's directions, turning onto narrow forest roads that became increasingly deserted. "I started to get nervous when we entered the forest," Mike admits. "There were no other cars, and there were few houses. I asked Rosie if she was sure about the address, and she said yes, that she and Jason had often come here as children." Uncle Frank's house turned out to be a modest one-story structure surrounded by tall trees. Jason's car was in the driveway, but there were no other cars in sight to indicate the presence of other guests. Mike parked next to Jason's car. "It was very quiet," Mike recalls. "Too quiet. No music, no voices, nothing you'd expect from a party. Rosie said that maybe we were the first ones there." They walked up to the front door, and Rosalinda knocked. A few seconds later, Jason opened the door. He was wearing clean jeans and a shirt, and he looked calm, but his eyes seemed strange, too bright, too focused. "He greeted us very formally," Mike says. "There wasn't the warmth I expected from the host of a party. He said welcome and invited us in, but something about his manner was off. Inside, the house was tidy, but there were no signs of preparations for a party. No snacks, drinks, music, or decorations." Jason explained that the other guests were running late, and that he had decided to start with a more intimate conversation among the three of them. Rosie looked a little disappointed, but not surprised, Mike recalls. She said something like, "That's even better, we'll have time to talk quietly." Jason agreed and invited us to sit in the living room. They spent about an hour in awkward conversation. Jason asked Mike questions about his job, his plans, his family. The conversation was polite, but tense. Rosalinda tried to keep the atmosphere light, but it was obvious that she felt uncomfortable. Jason couldn't take his eyes off Rosie, Mike says. "Not when I was talking, but when she was. It was like he was studying her reaction to every word I said. It was pretty creepy." Around 8 o'clock, Jason offered to show them around the house and neighborhood. He said his uncle had a nice lookout behind the house with a beautiful view of the woods. Rosalinda enthusiastically agreed, remembering how much they loved that spot as children. Rosie was happy to show me a place that meant a lot to her, Mike says. She talked about how she and Jason used to build forts out of branches there and have picnics. For her, it was a trip down memory lane. They left the house through the back door. Jason led them down a path into the woods, explaining that the lookout was about a 10-minute walk away. The sun was setting, and it was beginning to get dark among the trees. I offered to bring flashlights, Mike recalls, but Jason said he knew the way with his eyes closed, and that we'd be back before it got completely dark. Rosie trusted him, so I agreed. As they went deeper into the forest, the path became narrower and less distinct. Jason walked ahead with confident steps, Rosalinda followed him, and Mike brought up the rear. The sounds of civilization disappeared completely, leaving only the rustling of leaves underfoot and the distant sounds of the forest. At one point, I realized we had been walking for more than 10 minutes, Mike says. I asked Jason how much further we had to go, and he said we were almost there. But something in his voice had changed. He sounded determined. It was then, in the gathering twilight of the forest, far from home and even further from civilization, that events took a tragic turn. What Rosalinda thought was a long-awaited reconciliation with her best friend turned out to be something completely different. The last walk from which she would never return. At 5:47 a.m. on March 24, 2024, truck driver Carl Anderson was driving along Interstate 75 toward Daytona when he noticed something strange on the side of the road near exit 44. In the pre-dawn fog, he initially thought it was a bag of trash, but when he got closer, he realized his mistake. I stopped and turned on my emergency lights, recalls Anderson, a driver with 30 years of experience. I got closer and saw it was a girl. She was lying face down, her hair was disheveled. I knew right away she was dead, but I checked her pulse anyway. Her skin was cold. Anderson immediately called 911. The first patrol officers arrived at the scene 8 minutes later, followed by detectives and forensic technicians. The body belonged to a young woman, approximately 20 years old, wearing a blue dress that was torn and stained with dirt. Detective Rita Henderson received the call at 6:23 a.m. A 45-year-old Dayton police veteran with 20 years of experience, she specialized in homicide cases and was known for her meticulous investigations. Upon arriving at the scene, she immediately realized that this was no ordinary traffic accident. The position of the body was unnatural, Detective Henderson noted. She wasn't hit by a car. There were no skid marks, no damage to the road. Someone left her here already dead. The question was who and why they chose this particular location. Medical examiner Dr. Michael Chen arrived at the scene at 7:15 a.m. A preliminary examination revealed that death was caused by blunt force trauma to the head, likely inflicted by a heavy object. There were no signs of sexual assault, ruling out a random crime. The blow was delivered from behind, to the back of the head, Dr. Chen explained. Judging by the nature of the injury, a heavy object was used, possibly a rock or a metal tool. Death was almost instantaneous. In the victim's dress pocket, a driver's license was found bearing the name Rosalinda Elizabeth Butler, 22, with an address on Hawthorne Street in the Belmont neighborhood. Detective Henderson immediately recognized the area as a quiet place where serious crimes were rare. Forensic investigators found several important clues at the scene. Rosalinda's clothing had traces of dirt and leaves that were clearly not from the side of the highway. Her shoes were covered in mud, indicating that she had recently walked through a wooded area. Particles of bark and plant fibers were found under her fingernails. The picture was clear, said Detective Henderson. She was killed somewhere in the woods, then transported and left on the highway. The killer may have wanted to make it look like a traffic accident or simply dispose of the body where it would be found quickly. While forensic investigators worked at the crime scene, Detective Henderson went to Rosalinda's address to notify the family. At 8:30 a.m., she knocked on the door of the house on Hawthorne Street where Debbie Butler lived. I knew right away that something terrible had happened, Debbie recalls. The detective was very tactful, but when a police officer comes to your house on a Sunday morning, it never means anything good. When she said Rosie was dead, I just collapsed. Detective Henderson conducted the initial interview with the victim's mother. Debbie told her about Rosalinda's plans for Saturday night, a party at the home of Jason Miller, a childhood friend. She gave the detective the contact information for Jason and Mike Thompson, Rosalinda's boyfriend. The mother was in shock but very cooperative, Henderson notes. She told me about recent problems between Rosalinda and Jason, how he reacted to her new relationship. That immediately gave me a direction for the investigation. The first person Detective Henderson called was Mike Thompson. She found him at home at 9:45 a.m. Mike answered the phone with a sleepy voice, clearly just waking up. When the detective introduced herself and said she was calling about Rosalinda Butler, Mike's voice became alarmed. He immediately asked what had happened, Henderson recalls. When I told him that Rosalinda was dead, he seemed genuinely shocked. I heard him drop the phone and then sounds like he was vomiting. Detective Henderson asked Mike to come to the station to give a statement. He agreed immediately and arrived 30 minutes later, looking pale and shaken. His initial statement was rambling but detailed. Mike recounted the trip to Uncle Jason's house the night before. He described the strange atmosphere of the party, where there were no other guests, and the walk into the woods. According to him, at some point during the walk, he lost consciousness. Mike claimed that the last thing he remembered was walking down the path, Detective Henderson said. He said he felt dizzy, then blacked out. He woke up in his car in the parking lot of a shopping center in Dayton. Mike's story seemed strange to the detective, but a medical examination confirmed some of his statements. He had a small bump on the back of his head and marks on his wrists that looked like rope or plastic ties. Either he was telling the truth and was also a victim, or it was a very elaborate hoax, Henderson muses. But his emotional response seemed genuine, and the physical evidence supported his story. Blood tests showed traces of flunitrazepam, known as a date rape drug, in Mike's system. The amount was enough to cause loss of consciousness and memory lapses. This corroborated his story that he had been deliberately drugged. The next step was to find Jason Miller. Detective Henderson called him at 11:20 a.m., but no one answered. She left a message asking him to call back urgently, then drove to his home on Oak Street. Jason did not answer the door, but his car was not in the driveway. Neighbors said they had seen him on Saturday evening, but had not seen him return. Detective Henderson decided to check the auto repair shop where he worked. The owner of the auto repair shop, Rick Davis, said Jason didn't show up for work on Sunday, even though he was supposed to come in to finish an urgent job. This was unusual for him, as he never missed work without warning. Rick seemed concerned, Detective Henderson noted. He said Jason was a very reliable employee and that his absence without explanation was completely out of character. At 2:30 p.m., Detective Henderson received a call from a patrol officer who had spotted Jason's car, a gray Ford pickup truck, in the parking lot of a 24-hour store 5 miles from Interstate 75. The car was locked, and there were no keys inside. Forensic investigators examined the vehicle and found several important clues. There were traces of soil in the bed that matched samples found on Rosalinda's clothing. On the side panel, there were microscopic traces of blue fabric similar to the material of the victim's dress. The evidence indicated that Rosalinda's body had been transported in this vehicle, explains forensic investigator David Lopez. The distribution of dirt and fibers suggested that the body had been in the bed of the pickup truck. Detective Henderson also reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses. A gas station camera captured a gray pickup truck driving by at 3:22 a.m. on March 24th, heading toward Interstate 75. The driver was not clearly visible, but the size and silhouette matched Jason's. The timeline was starting to come together, Henderson said. But we still needed to find Jason and figure out what exactly happened in that woods. The search for Jason intensified. His photo was sent to all patrol cars, and flyers were posted at bus and train stations. Detective Henderson also obtained a search warrant for Jason's uncle's home. Frank Miller's house was exactly where Mike had described it. The location was truly isolated, perfect for a crime with no witnesses. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual for an empty house. Inside the house, forensic investigators found signs of recent human presence. There were 3 glasses in the living room, one of which contained the remains of a drink laced with flunitrazepam. The kitchen showed signs of party preparations, but most of the food was untouched. The picture was clear, says Detective Henderson. They were really there, just like Mike said. Jason slipped the drug into Mike's drink and then led them into the woods. The most important discovery was made in the backyard. The path into the woods was clearly visible, and forensic investigators followed it about half a mile into the woods. There, they found what was clearly the crime scene. The site was in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The ground was disturbed, the grass was trampled, and there were traces of blood on several trees. A large rock near the clearing was stained with blood, and hair matching samples from Rosalinda. This is where it happened, concluded forensic investigator Lopez. The distribution of blood indicated that the blow was delivered at this exact spot. Judging by the marks on the ground, the body was dragged back to the house after the blow. Analysis of the crime scene also showed that Mike had indeed been there. His shoe prints were found on the path leading to the clearing, but there was no evidence of his involvement in the murder itself. On the contrary, the evidence suggested that he had lost consciousness before the crime was committed. A reconstruction of the events of that night began to take shape. After Mike lost consciousness from the drug, the killer somehow got Rosalind to the clearing. He may have told her that Mike had fallen and needed help, or used another excuse to lure her there. The murder was not spontaneous, concludes Dr. Susan Wright, a psychologist who consulted on the investigation. The use of drugs, the choice of an isolated location, the preparation, all of this points to a premeditated crime. The killer knew what he was going to do. By Sunday evening, Jason Miller was still at large. Detectives checked the homes of all his acquaintances, his workplace, and even contacted his Uncle Frank, who was on a flight to California. No one had seen Jason since Saturday evening. Jason's disappearance was telling, Detective Henderson said. An innocent man doesn't disappear right after killing his best friend. But we needed more than circumstantial evidence. We needed Jason. That evening, Detective Henderson met with the police chief to discuss the case. The evidence pointed in one direction, but without a suspect, the case couldn't move forward. The decision was made to intensify the search and ask the public for help. We had a clear picture of what had happened, Henderson said. A young woman had been brutally murdered by someone she trusted. Now we needed to find the killer and bring him to justice. Local news channels reported the murder on Sunday evening. Jason's photo was shown as the man wanted for questioning in connection with the death of Rosalinda Butler. The police phone started ringing with reports of possible sightings. One of the reports came from a cashier at the 24-hour store where Jason's car had been found. She remembered a nervous young man who had bought a bus ticket to Cincinnati around 4 a.m. The description matched Jason. He looked agitated, kept looking over his shoulder, said cashier Brenda Wilson. He paid cash and asked when the next bus was coming. I thought it was strange to buy a ticket at 4 in the morning, but decided it was none of my business. Detective Henderson contacted the Cincinnati police to check bus stations and hotels in the area. If Jason had indeed gone there, he could try to hide or continue on to another city. As the search continued, the Belmont community was reeling from the news of the murder. Rosalinda was well known in the neighborhood, and many couldn't believe that anyone would want to hurt her. The library where she worked was closed on Monday as a sign of respect. It shattered our illusion of safety, said Linda Carter, the library's director. Rosie was such a kind, innocent girl. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Jason Miller was found on Tuesday, March 26th, at a motel on the outskirts of Cincinnati by Officer Dan Reeves during a routine check. The motel manager recognized him from a photo in the news and called the police. When officers knocked on the door of room 12, Jason did not resist arrest. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, Officer Reeves recalled. He was thin, unshaven, with red eyes. When I told him he was under arrest for the murder of Rosalinda Butler, he just nodded and held out his hands for the handcuffs. Detective Henderson arrived in Cincinnati 3 hours after the arrest. Jason was taken back to Dayton, where he was charged with first-degree murder. During the transport, he was silent, staring out the window and occasionally crying quietly. This was not the cold, calculating killer I expected to see, Detective Henderson said. This was a broken young man who seemed to be fully aware of the magnitude of what he had done. The first interview took place on Wednesday morning, in the presence of a court-appointed attorney. Jason waived his right to remain silent and agreed to give a statement. His account of the events of that Saturday night was detailed and painfully honest. Jason started by saying, "I didn't plan to kill her," Detective Henderson recalls. But as he told his story, it became clear that what he had planned was almost as horrific. According to Jason, the idea for the party was not an attempt at reconciliation, but a way to separate Rosalinda from Mike. He planned to slip a drug into Mike's drink to knock him out, then convince Rosalinda that her boyfriend had shown his true colors, becoming aggressive and threatening while drunk. "I thought that if she saw him like that, she would realize that he wasn't the person he claimed to be," Jason told detectives. "I wanted to save her from him. I wanted her to come back to me." The plan began to unfold as intended. Mike drank the spiked drink and began to feel ill during their walk in the woods. When he lost consciousness, Jason told Rosalinda that Mike had apparently had too much to drink and that they should leave him to rest until he sobered up. "Rosie was worried about Mike," Jason continued. "She wanted to call an ambulance, but I convinced her that he would be fine, that he just needed to sleep. I said we could take a walk while he came to." It was during this walk that Jason tried to explain his feelings to Rosalind. He told her how much he loved her, not as a friend, but as a man. He begged her to give him a chance to prove that he could make her happier than Mike ever had. "Rosie's reaction wasn't what I expected," Jason told detectives, his voice trembling. "She wasn't moved. She was scared. She said I was acting weird and that she wanted to go back to Mike. I knew I had lost her forever." Psychologist Dr. Susan Wright, who observed the interview, notes, "At that moment, reality collided with Jason's fantasy. The years of illusions he had built up about Rosalinda secretly loving him came crashing down. For someone with his type of attachment disorder, it was catastrophic." When Rosalinda started to leave, demanding that they go back to Mike, Jason grabbed her arm. A struggle ensued. Rosalinda tried to break free, screaming that he was crazy and that she would never be with him. "She said I wasn't her friend anymore," Jason said, crying. "That I never was, that a real friend wouldn't do that. She said she hated me for what I did to Mike. And something inside me broke." In a fit of rage and despair, Jason picked up a rock and hit Rosalinda on the head. She fell and didn't move. Jason sat next to her body for several minutes, unable to believe what had happened. "I kept shaking her, calling her name," he said. "I thought maybe she was just unconscious, but when I realized she was dead, I didn't know what to do. I just panicked." The next few hours were a blur in Jason's memory. He carried the body back to the house and put it in the back of his pickup truck. Mike was still unconscious in the woods. Jason considered killing him too, but couldn't bring himself to do it. "I realized he was a victim too," Jason explained. "He didn't do anything wrong except fall in love with her. I tied him up and left him in the woods, thinking someone would find him in the morning." Jason drove Rosalinda's body to the highway, thinking that if he left her there, it would look like a traffic accident. Then he returned for Mike, who was still unconscious, and drove him into town, leaving him in his car in a shopping center parking lot. "I thought he would wake up and not remember what happened," Jason said. "The drug was supposed to erase his memory. I thought I could tell the police that we had a good time and then Rosie left with a stranger. But the plan fell apart almost immediately. Jason realized he had left too many clues behind and that his story wouldn't hold up. In a panic, he abandoned his car and bought a bus ticket, hoping to hide in another city. He didn't have a real escape plan. notes Detective Henderson. It was an impulsive decision made by someone in a panic. He only took the money from his wallet and thought he could start a new life somewhere else. During questioning, Jason also revealed the extent of his obsession with Rosalind. Hundreds of photos of her were found in his home, including pictures taken secretly. He kept a detailed diary of her daily activities, noting who she talked to, what she ate, and what she wore. It was a pathological fixation, explains Dr. Wright. Jason didn't see Rosalinda as an individual with her own rights and desires. To him, she was an object that belonged to him. When that illusion was shattered, he couldn't cope. Jason's testimony was corroborated by physical evidence. An analysis of his clothing revealed traces of Rosalind's blood. Soil from the crime scene was found on his work boots. The timeline of his actions matched witness statements and surveillance camera footage. Mike Thompson, who had fully recovered by that point, provided additional testimony. His memories of that night were fragmented due to the drug, but he confirmed the main details of Jason's account of how the evening began. It was awful to find out that someone Rosie considered her best friend was capable of doing something like that, Mike says. But in a way, it also explained a lot of the strange behavior we hadn't understood. Jason was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and assault. His lawyer considered a plea of insanity, but a psychological evaluation found that Jason understood the nature of his actions during the crime. He suffered from attachment disorder and showed signs of obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, Dr. Wright concluded. But he wasn't psychotic. He knew the difference between right and wrong. The trial took place in October 2024. Jason pleaded guilty in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He wanted to avoid a jury trial and the death penalty, and he did not want to put Rosalinda's family through the painful process. His guilty plea was the only decent thing he did in this case, said Prosecutor James Connolly. It spared the family from having to hear all the horrific details over and over again. The Belmont community slowly recovered from the tragedy. The library where Rosalinda worked established a memorial fund in her name to help young people get an education. Mike Thompson transferred to another school in Columbus, saying he couldn't stay in a place that reminded him of Rosalinda. It took months to feel safe again, says Linda Carter of the library. We all knew Jason. He seemed like a quiet, harmless young man. To learn that he was capable of murder made us question how well we know the people around us. Debbie Butler continues to work as a nurse at Miami Valley Hospital. She sees a therapist to cope with the trauma of losing her daughter and the guilt she feels for not recognizing the danger in Jason's behavior. I keep asking myself if there was something I could have done differently, Debbie says. Were there signs that I missed? Should I have insisted that Rosie distance herself from him sooner? But my therapist tells me that I couldn't have known how dangerous he was. Jason is serving his sentence at the Marion Correctional Institution in Ohio. He is participating in psychological counseling programs and, according to prison counselors, shows genuine remorse for his actions. He wrote a letter of apology to Rosalinda's family, but they decided not to read it. Some apologies come too late, says Debbie Butler. No words will bring my daughter back. Rosalinda Butler's case has become a subject of study for criminal psychologists. Dr. Wright uses it as an example of how unrecognized attachment disorders can lead to tragic consequences. Rosalinda Butler's story serves as a grim reminder that the greatest danger sometimes comes from those we trust the most. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew her, and in the lessons her tragedy taught about the nature of obsession, control, and the price of what happens when love turns into possession.